I have a question to ask you. I put on my Sunday best for it and everything. A serious one. Should black people be Christian? If that question makes you feel uncomfortable, you're in luck, because I'm not gonna answer it. I can't. Well, I probably can, but I was told I shouldn't. But there's a reason why for 400 years that's been such a loaded question. That's because it's a question that has 400 loaded years of history behind it. I'm wearing white right now. Not because of white supremacy, which I'm about to talk about. More because this is a blank canvas. And a lack of colored commentary is good right now.
A slave theology and preaching of obedience to earthly masters was forced upon enslaved Africans, but it wasn't without a counter argument, a paradoxical situation. Enslaved Africans didn't always simply accept this. The first invisible institution of the black church reframed Christianity in many ways into a toolkit, something to help, even if it was simultaneously used to oppress. Enslaved Africans were reacting against something. There was a heresy to white Christianity at the time, and some argue even now. But the black church emerged not just as a place of worship, but a place where the humanity of enslaved Africans, the humanity of black Americans, was recognized, even when it wasn't legally. The scholar S.E. Allen makes a point of us to not simply look at what the black church believes in. That's easy, but what it does. Regardless of theological arguments, the black church has been used within abolitionist movements as well as civil rights. Martin Luther King, for example. The black church, in many ways, could be said to emerge from white Christianity. White Christianity that was used to punish and hurt African Americans, but in many ways, it is just as much a reaction.
Text itself. It's a good question. Great question. Great question. I tried messaging Soldier for Christ. I would never enlist in the army myself. That's a personal opinion. But if I don't find somebody, this is kind of like talking to a brick wall. So let's have a conversation with the pastor of one of the fastest growing black churches in America, Pastor Vernon Gordon. He's a mentor, but I'm not going to let him off that easy. History shows that black Americans within church aren't victims. Well, in many ways they were victims, but not the kind that lay down flat, the kind that fight. And even as conversations continue to evolve around the authenticity of black Christianity, it's hard to argue that the at first invisible institution didn't have an impact far beyond scripture or beliefs. It affected rights, legislation, organized movements. There are a lot of black Christians today. But it's not like the bad parts of history didn't happen. How exactly do we cope with that?
People groups and people of color particularly. But I think it's important to note that when we trace back the origin story of Christianity, it actually doesn't start in slavery. And I think what can happen is, if we're not careful, we'll feel like that our story as Christians also starts with our story of chattel slavery. And the origin story of Christianity is thousands of years, before chattel slavery. We all know that, we were slaves in America and brought over to this country maybe 400 years ago, around, give or take. But the story of Jesus is 2,000 years ago. And I think when we kind of embrace that, that means that there's a version of Christianity that existed far before there was a version of chattel slavery. I also think it's really important, and I think one of the things we miss is to then ask the question, a question that often comes up, is Christianity the white man's religion? And I think that is a minimization of the colorism of the Bible. When you read through the New Testament, we actually see that before there's ever a European gospel, there is an African gospel. Other thing to keep in mind when it comes to American chattel slavery, one of the things I saw when I was in Ghana is how there could be chapels that were literally right above slave quarters. And that is difficult to reconcile. Like, how do you sing about Jesus on top of bodies that are being oppressed and marginalized and dehumanized right below your feet? Dangerous about culture right now, particularly around Christianity, is not that we should not acknowledge that there's been a counterfeit Christianity that many of us have been raised around. But I do think we have to be careful about rejecting what is authentic because we've experienced something that's counterfeit.
I can't shake the feeling that there's an elephant in the room regarding this conversation. Well, it's not an elephant. It's a book. And it's the most popular and arguably most influential book of all time. What does it have to say?
And we see this in culture often. This is a very socio-political look at what I think is oftentimes a very metaphysical question. The book of Leviticus 25:44 seems to explicitly have God allow for the enslavement and purchase of people. And for any group of people, but specifically Black Americans who know the effects of that, how are we supposed to rectify, deal with, as people within faith, as Black Americans in faith, kind of deal with, this thing seems to very clearly show a God that supports the enslavement of people. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly.
There is historical analysis, right? What was happening historically as a construct. There is literary analysis. There are certain phrases in the Bible that you might say, that I can't believe somebody would say that. We have to remind ourselves that it was translated from original Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic text, and there are words in the English language that don't always align. When you look at Leviticus, what we're talking about is it's important to understand what is the historical analysis and exegesis and the cultural analysis and exegesis that is happening at the time. One, it's important to name, for those who would say, Western Christianity and Western theology is the sole culprit of our understanding of slavery and so forth and so on, I think would be false because, again, even as somebody who's traveled and know people personally who lived in African countries, slavery didn't start in America alone. Slavery was something that existed amongst all real cultures, right? All kind of human culture. And I think that my personal theological opinion is that ultimately God is displeased with any mistreatment and dehumanization of people. But I think what we're seeing in Leviticus specifically is we're seeing a cultural context where people considered it a cultural norm of them. I think it's also important to name that what was most common at the time was not the type of dehumanized slavery that we saw in American chattel slavery. That often what we're seeing in scripture is indentured servitude. That is actually representative not of the same imagery that we saw with whips and chains, bondage, and being stolen in the same fashion, but rather it is a byproduct of a cultural ideology that was more familiar and prominent at the time. That in mind, it's important to name that I don't think what we're seeing is God's intent for dehumanization. I think what we're actually seeing is God's instruction for sustainability for people who actually just came out of slavery. He not only delivers them, but he directs them. He protects them. This is where we get the Red Sea. He closes the Red Sea on their enemies, right? Everything we see from the character of God in the book of Exodus seems to be God's love, God's protection, and God's preservation. People that you come in contact with, and that these are principles and practices that will help preserve you as a nation, but they were not intended to practice the same type of slavery that we begin to see in modern culture 400 years ago in Western America.
You are to accept axiomatically that the ownership of another human being is wrong and inherently dehumanizing, even with permission. You know what I mean? When we look at things, for example, like modern day prostitution, which oftentimes comes from a lens of like people doing things willingly, but still in a vulnerable position in which they could be abused. You know what I mean? Vulnerable position in which they don't have the same rights or protections as other workers would have, you know what I mean, and other citizens would have. The common argument of why does God need to play geopolitics in a sense? Yes, this thing, slavery is morally wrong. We get the idea that slavery is morally wrong from Judeo-Christian values. But God kind of has to just like work his way up, and we see this thing still happening, as to opposes where a lot of people would other say, well, there are other moments where, snap me 30 years to create the conditions in which a sea could split. And so for people that I think they wrestle with specifically with an omnipotent God, is the idea that any types of thumbs up, even if that thumbs up is later revoked or is later changed with a new covenant, is still a thumbs up that could have been avoided. The idea that there was no need for God to have people be enslaved in the first place.
That is a question that we can't answer and never will, which is, God, if you could do it this way, why not?
Should black people be Christian? Yes or no answer.
Yes.
Okay.
Black people should be Christian.